Okay, so, you've seen the title and the thumbnail, and I know it sounds a little weird, but I think the idea that Paimon might actually be some form of Seelie has some merit when you consider the history of Teyvat from the myths that are spread. Basically, first, there was Ajdaha and Co. They were known as the Seven Sovereigners, and were sort of in charge of whatever there was before our version of the world. Then the Primordial One showed up and beat them all up and created the Teyvat we know today. Or mostly, anyways. Humans started to gain intelligence and were ruled over by the 4 different shades that the Primordial One made from themselves. Everything was peaceful. And then Seelie and the Moon Sisters came a-knocking, being known as the Second Who Came. At some point, a war broke out with the Primordial One and their shades on one side, and the Seelies and the Moon Sisters on the other. But what exactly happened isn't the clearest. It seems like maybe the Primordial One won? Maybe? The people in khaenri'ah seem to think that, at least. Either way, what's important to note here is less the war and more about the introduction about the Seelie to Teyvat, and a certain leeway myth. Once upon a time, the Seelie we see today was different. Instead of the ghostly appearance, Seelie had their own physical form and wisdom from years of experience, both in Teyvat and from wherever they came from. One day, the Seelie met a traveler from afar and the two got married. The Moon Sisters watched over the ceremony, and for 30 days, everything was calm. Then, there was a disaster, and the wedded pair were forced to flee. Unfortunately, the two were caught and forced apart. Though the fate of the otherworldly traveler was unknown, the Seelie and the sisters went into mourning. As they pulled away from society, they gradually started to lose themselves. The Seelie's form, voice, and mind were lost. Bits of themselves were left behind in mountains and ruins, and these echoes carried the grief and love that Seelie had for their lover, the emotions pushing Seelie to guide lost travelers to treasure as they seek for any hints that might point them to their forgotten past. The Moon Sisters, meanwhile, began to fight one another until only one was left alive, becoming the moon over Teyvat that we see today, and bringing an end to the tragic tale. Now, even the records of Juyeon, Volume 4, admits that this is just a myth that is spread around the Leeway Mountains area, and so the story should be taken with a grain of salt. But that being said, it was written into the game and does line up with some of the new lore we gained from Khaenri'ah, so that salt should be taken with a grain of salt. Some more salt or pepper, maybe? I don't know. I'm going to move away from this turn of phrase now and move on to the main thing. That thing being to look at the similarities between Paimon and Seelies. Besides the size and the floating, obviously both are drawn to travelers and both are eager to work as a guide for the person that they found. And Paimon being a Seelie would also help explain her love for treasure. All it takes is a hint of treasure, and she is pushing us to take on whatever the person has requested of us. This would also explain Paimon's patchy knowledge of Teyvat. While she can act as our guide for general information about Teyvat and nature, she's pretty oblivious when it comes to the cities and cultures. If Paimon was but a fragment of the original Seelie, it would make sense that she only has a fraction of knowledge about the land, since she wouldn't have witnessed the changes occurring. So why then would Paimon have a humanesque form while the other fragments of Seelies are all spirits? Well, I think it's possible that Paimon is a mini version of the original Seelie. After all, while parts of Seelie were left behind in their grief, someone's physical form doesn't just disappear, especially if the person isn't dead. Plus, if the idea was that the Seelie lost part of themselves, the voice and form would have to go somewhere. And now we've reached the second half of the theory, which gets a little weird. I don't really have proof for this half of the theory, and technically it kind of goes against what was written in the game, but as myths are often exaggerated, and the tablet it comes from, Before the Sun and Moon, has the writer admitting that they don't really know the truth about the events, I feel like it can pull on some strings. So basically, like I said at the beginning of the video, Before the Sun and Moon tells about how the Moon Sisters and Seelie came to Teyvat and got into a war with the Primordial One. In the text, we're led to believe that the Primordial One and the Shades were victorious because their power was what kept khaenri'ah under the water, which led them to believe that the Primordial One was still kicking around. However, there is no actual confirmation of that. In fact, it almost makes sense to me that the Moon Sisters and the Seelie won the war, or that they at least reached some sort of settlement that led to a draw, since we still see Seelies hanging around. When you compare that to what happened to the 7 Summoners, who we can presume were put to sleep and hidden in the land, much like Azhdaha was, it wouldn't really make sense for the Primordial One and their friends to just leave the Seelies and the Moon siblings around in Teyvat if they lost. Plus, there's also the fact that the Seelies and the Moon Sisters are still pretty prominent in modern Teyvat, whereas only the Time Shade, also known as Ishtaroth, Kiritos, Kitarashi, or the one shade that, didn't just abandon people when war happened, was seemingly the only ones remembered above ground. This would also explain why the Blessing of the Wilken Moon emphasizes one of the Moon Sisters, why Primogems, or stars, things that the Moon Sisters loved, are how we summon characters, and why the Spiral Abyss uses phases of the moon. The whole space and sky themage makes sense under the context of the Moon Sisters and Seelies being able to gain power from the war. But I don't think the Primordial One was killed. I think there must have been some sort of settlement or draw, like I previously mentioned, that led to the creation of the 7 and the Heavenly Principle. Now, what the Heavenly Principle is another mystery, but they seem to align with the idea of preventing people from having too much knowledge. Erosion, which we've seen impact both Azhdaha and Zhongli, affect their memories and abilities. And I sort of believe that when khaenri'ah broke the Heavenly Principle and Calamity started, that's when everything with Seelie went down. See, when the story is told in the records of Jueyun, it not only says that a disaster happens, but that the wedded couple were fleeing the calamity. Now, word choice is kind of important, and when you have a major event that is crucial to the plot, you would realistically kind of want to not use that specific word unless referencing that specific event. So it kind of seems like the disastrous end to the Seelies' marriage was tied to khaenri'ah, which has the implications, which is the part that sounds crazy, because all of this tied together would mean that we were looking for a Seelie's marriage partner, or Paimon's marriage partner, who is A, from another world, and B, somehow tied to khaenri'ah, and one person fits that really well. And it makes sense that our sibling may have been hanging out prior to the calamity, since, they became the prince or princess of the Abyss. They clearly have a deep tie to the people of khaenri'ah, which would make sense if they were made before the whole Abyss creature thing happened. So Paimon equals Seelie equals married to our sibling, maybe? And I know it sounds really weird, but it ties into the idea that the Pyro Lector was going on about how Paimon might betray us, and the Seelie's whole goal is to find out about their past. So it kind of worked, with Paimon facing a huge dilemma of what she would do, because she would love our sibling, but then she would also want to be with us, and then where side would she be on, and yada yada yada. And yeah, I don't know how true the latter half is of Paimon being married to our sibling, but I felt like it was something that I should point out because it made sense. And the main reason that I am reluctant to believe it is because if you're running around as Aether, that means Paimon would have married Lumine, which would be gay and censorship. Though they do have a lot of fun showing off certain relationships that are heavily hinted at. But, that's a different thing. I'm gonna end this now before I ramble any longer. Goodbye.